So here we are at the beginning of the second unit of our course in AP Microeconomics. As I said at the beginning of the course, the first two units establish the fundamental concepts of understanding economics. We went through the basics of scarcity, opportunity cost, production possibilities, and comparative advantage in the first unit. And in the second unit, we will turn our attention to understanding the laws of supply and demand, which are fundamental to understanding how economic forces work in a free market-based economy, such as that is what we have here in the United States. After we finish this unit, then we start diverging into microeconomic material that is specific to microeconomics. So let's continue our work. So in Module 5, we are going to introduce the concept of demand and look at the law of demand and how it operates in a market economy. So in this module, I will begin by describing what a competitive market actually is and how it is described by the supply and demand model, the third model that we will look at. I will then show you what the demand curve is and how it's drawn. We'll look at the difference between what we call a movement along the demand curve and a shift of the demand curve, or a change in demand. And then we will look at the factors that actually cause this shift of the demand curve and what that means. So we begin by looking at a model of a competitive market. Now, if you remember back in the first unit of the course, I told you that the reason we use models in economics is because we are trying to understand how the complicated world works, and we are trying to simplify reality. And so when economists use models, they are simplifying that reality, and they make certain simplifying assumptions that would not necessarily hold in the real world, but help us to understand how the real world actually operates. We looked at the production possibilities model in the first unit, and we touched briefly on the circular flow model, and now we are going to look at another model, which is the supply and demand model. So when we talk about a competitive market, we're referring to a market in a market-based economy, or a free market system as it's sometimes called. There are other economic systems that operate in the world. Economic systems are systems that societies choose to determine how the three basic economic questions are answered. What goods and services get produced, how are those goods and services produced, and who gets those goods and services once they are produced. And the type of economic system that a society chooses is usually based on what kinds of economic goals it wishes to emphasize. Goals such as economic choice and freedom, economic growth, economic efficiency, economic equity, and economic security. And some economic systems do better at achieving these goals than other ones. All of those goals can be achieved in each economic system, but some systems emphasize certain goals than other ones. For example, two types of economic systems that we haven't talked about much yet are traditional economies and centrally planned or command economies. We don't find many traditional economies left in the world today. They are generally found in very small isolated communities like Native American communities in northern Alaska, or the Amish communities here in the United States, or in tribal communities in certain parts of Asia and Africa. Centrally planned or command economies are what we often associate with communist countries. Command economy was dominant in the old Soviet Union and the countries of Eastern Europe when they were communist, but of course since the fall of the Soviet Union, those economies have been replaced with more market-based reforms. China is still a centrally planned economy, although it has been instituting many more market reforms. And then Cuba and North Korea are two other countries that are still considered to be primarily centrally planned economies. But most countries of the world have market-based economies with elements of government regulation and intervention in them. And the extent to which the government is involved in regulating the economy and intervening in the economy determines how much central planning there might be. Some countries adopt more central planning than others if they want to pursue more equity and security within a market-based system. Other countries like the United States that tend to emphasize economic growth and efficiency and economic freedom more will have less government regulation in their economies. But we are still a market-based economy, which means it is market forces, what Adam Smith referred to as the invisible hand, that help to answer those fundamental economic questions in our society. Market forces determine what goods and services get produced. Market forces determine how those goods and services are produced, and market forces determine primarily who gets those goods and services in our economy. And so what we will find is that market forces are made up of the free economic choices made by millions of economic consumers and producers. So what is a competitive market then, since we have a market-based economy? Well, a market is any institution or mechanism which brings together buyers, that we will call demanders, and sellers, that we will call suppliers, of particular goods and services. So anytime someone that wants to buy a good or service meets up with someone that wants to sell them that good or service, we say a market for that good or service has been created. Now, there are a number of characteristics that you need to keep in mind about markets. Number one, a market can be local, it can be a national market, or it can be an international market. So it can vary in scope and size. The second thing to know about a competitive market is that some markets are highly personal, with face-to-face exchanges between the buyer and the seller, and flexible prices that can be negotiated between the buyer and seller, such as at a garage sale or an estate auction. While other markets may be highly impersonal, where the buyer and seller never meet each other. Many online and digital markets operate this way. The stock market operates this way. And those markets can be remote. It could be the global market for oil in a far-off land, or the global market for coffee beans made somewhere else. The third thing to remember about a competitive market is that when we talk about competitive markets, we are, in this module and in this unit, we're talking about competitive markets that have a large number of independent buyers and sellers. So that is going to be a model of what we will eventually call perfect competition. And when we begin to study the competitive market model, we use a perfectly competitive market as the model of choice. And there are reasons for this. But we will find that in our market-based system, there are other market structures that operate, and we will get to those in a later unit. But for now, our assumption is that competitive markets operate with a large number of independent buyers and a large number of independent sellers. And because of that, the fourth thing that we emphasize is that each of these buyers and sellers are so small, and their impact on the total market is so tiny, that no individual buyer or seller can affect the price of the product, the price that it is sold at. They have to accept whatever the market determines to be the price as the price that they accept for their good or service if they continue with it, or if you're a seller or if you're a buyer of a good, that you have to accept the market price if you want to buy that good. So the assumption of competitive markets just simplifies the analysis. Much information can be gained by looking at demand and supply in a competitive market like this. And in later chapters of this course, we will study markets that are not perfectly competitive. But for now, we assume perfect competition, with many buyers and sellers buying an identical good or service. So the goods or services sold do not differ from each other in any way, and no independent buyer or seller can affect the price that that good is sold at. They are such a small part of the market. So, when we look at the supply and demand model, this is a model of how a competitive market actually works. And there are 5 key elements that we will study in this unit to explain the supply and demand model of a competitively market-based economy. We will look at the demand curve, then we will look at the supply curve, then we will look at demand and supply curve shifts. We will then combine those to determine the market equilibrium, and then we will see what happens when there are changes in the market equilibrium. Now, the first thing that we need to talk about when we look at the law of demand is the difference between the demand schedule and the demand curve. A demand schedule is a table that shows how much of a good or service consumers will want to buy at different prices. So here we have a demand schedule for cotton. And this demand schedule shows how much cotton consumers are willing and able to buy at each of a series of possible prices during a specified time period. So let me go back to the previous slide. So as we look at this demand schedule, it shows us a couple of things. First of all, this is an example of one type of demand schedule. In this case, the demand schedule for cotton. The second thing that demand schedule shows us is that it shows us how much cotton buyers are willing and able to buy at 7 possible prices that are shown here, ranging from 50 cents up to $2 per pound of cotton in increments of 25 cents per pound. The third thing that we know is that the market price that cotton will be sold at will depend upon the interaction of supply and demand. And finally, to be meaningful, the demand schedule must have a period of time associated with it. So in this case, we're saying this is the number of pounds of cotton that can be produced in a week, or a number of pounds that will be demanded in a week. So keep this table handy in your notes because we are going to return to it when we discuss supply curves. The demand schedule shows that when the price is high, the quantity of cotton in this case, the quantity of cotton demanded is low. This relationship is so true that we call it a law of economics. We call it the law of demand. So the law of demand is a fundamental characteristic of demand behavior. First, other things being equal, as the price of a good increases, the corresponding quantity demanded falls. So you'll notice here that as the price per pound of cotton rises, the quantity of cotton beans that will be purchased in the market goes down. At 50 cents, 4.2 billion pounds of cotton will be purchased. At 75 cents a pound, only 11.5 pounds of cotton will be purchased. And if we go all the way up to $2 per pound of cotton, we see that only 7.1 billion pounds of cotton will actually be purchased. So the law of demand states that as the price of a good rises, other things being equal, assuming all other variables remain constant, the corresponding quantity demanded will fall. And the opposite is true. As the price of a good falls, the quantity demanded of that good will rise. Restating this, that means there is an inverse relationship between these two variables. There is an inverse relationship between the price of a good and the quantity demanded of that good. And when we say other things being equal, we are making an assumption. The assumption we are making when we say other things being equal refers to a handful of other factors that can also affect our demand for a good. But right now, we're assuming that all of those other factors remain stable and constant, and the only thing changing and affecting the demand for the good is a change in the price of a good. And so as the price of the good goes up, the quantity demanded falls, and as the price of the good falls, other things being equal, the quantity demanded will rise. We will cover those other factors shortly. Now, once we have our demand schedule, then we can create what is called a demand curve. Okay? And so we plot the 7 prices and quantities demanded in a graph. We have a y-axis, and on the y-axis, we always use the y-axis to establish the price of a good. Price is always graphed on the y-axis, and it's always important that we label our graphs. You will have to draw graphs on tests in here and on the AP exam in May, and when you do that, it is important that you always fully and completely and accurately label all of your graphs, all of your axes and everything else, because you can earn points on the test and the exam for proper labeling of your graph. So here, we plot these 7 prices and plot those as different points on the graph. Then we draw a line connecting each of those points, and that line is labeled capital D, and we call it the demand curve. And the demand curve shows the inverse relationship between price, graphed on the y-axis, and quantity of cotton in billions of pounds that is always graphed on the x-axis, or the horizontal axis. And we can see from the demand schedule that this shows that inverse relationship. As the price of a good falls on the y-axis, the quantity demanded of the good as measured on the x-axis rises. And as the price of the good rises as measured on the y-axis, the quantity demanded of the good falls as measured on the x-axis. So the demand curve illustrates this inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. The downward slope, we say the demand curve has a shape that is downward sloping, and the downward slope indicates lower quantity as measured on the horizontal axis at higher prices as measured on the vertical axis, and higher quantity at lower prices. So, when the price of cotton falls from $1.50 to $1, the quantity demanded of cotton falls from 8.1 billion pounds, or the quantity demanded of the good rises, I should say, from 8.1 billion pounds to 10 billion pounds when the price falls from $1.50 to $1. This is a movement down the demand curve. So we call this movement along the demand curve, because when we move from one point on the demand curve to another point on the same demand curve, we call this a change in quantity demanded, and a change in quantity demanded is only caused by movement along the demand curve, which is caused only by a change in the price of a good. So if the price of a good changes and rises, we move along the demand curve from one point to another, and the quantity demanded falls. When the price of a good falls, we move along the demand curve from one point to another point, and the quantity demanded of the good rises. So holding all other things constant that can affect our demand for the good, this is a movement up or down the demand curve. So a demand curve is the graphical representation of the demand schedule, and it shows how much of a good or service consumers want to buy at any given price. But when we said other things being equal, we were implying that there are other things that can affect our willingness to buy a good. Remember what demand is. Demand means that we are willing to buy a good at a certain price, and we are able to buy a good at a certain price. So to demand something means that at that price it will actually be bought. It will actually be purchased. It includes both willingness and ability to pay that price. That is what demand means. If someone is willing to pay the price but they're not able to, they don't demand it. If they are able to pay the price for something but not willing to pay it, they don't demand it. You are only demanding something if you are both willing and able to pay the given price for a good or service. And that means it is actually purchased. That is what demand means. So up until now, we've only looked at how one factor affects our demand for a good. And that is when the price of the good changes. And that causes movement along the demand curve from one point to another point as the price changes. But we said other things being equal. So there are other things that can affect our demand for a good or service and cause us to demand more or less of it, to buy more or less of it. And when this happens, this shifts the entire demand curve. It moves the entire demand curve to the right on the horizontal axis or to the left on the horizontal axis. And that means at every possible price, more of the good is purchased or less of the good is purchased. We call these things demand shifters, or the other things besides price which affect demand. So changes in a demand shifter cause a change in demand. Only a change in the price of a good causes a change in quantity demanded. and movement from one point along the demand curve to another. And it's important to keep that language in mind. Economists mean very specific things when they use specific language. When you refer to a change in quantity demanded, that means you are referring to movement along the demand curve from one point to another, and that can only be caused by a change in price. When you refer to a change in demand, you are referring to a shift of the entire demand curve at every possible price. And that is caused not by a change in price, but is caused by one of these other things. So let's look now at what these other things are. What can cause a change in a shifter to cause a change in demand? Now, one thing to keep in mind, if demand is increased, then we are moving to the right along the horizontal axis, because that shows an increase in the good on the horizontal axis. So that means that at any price, consumers wish to buy more of the good. If demand has decreased, then the entire demand curve shifts to the left, because that shows a decrease on the horizontal axis. And that means that at any price, consumers wish to buy less of the good. So what can affect that? Well, one thing that can affect that is an increase in the size of the population. Okay? We refer to this as a change in the number of buyers. If the population increases, then we have more buyers for a good or service. The more buyers we have leads to an increase in demand. If the population decreases, then we have fewer buyers to buy a good or service, and fewer buyers will lead to a decrease in demand. For example, demand for prescription drugs has increased. Why? Because the population of elderly people has increased. Another example would be that the demand for infant formula would decrease if families have fewer babies. So this could cause a rise in the quantity demanded at any given price. The example that I have here on this slide shows demand schedules for cotton between 2012 and 2013. And you can see that at every single price, the demand for cotton increased between 2012 and 2013. So something else had to cause that other than a change in the price of a good. So this is represented by the two demand schedules, one showing demand in 2012 before the rise in population, the other showing demand in 2013 after the rise in population. So when we talk about a shift of the demand curve, this is what it looks like. A shift of the demand curve is a change in the quantity demanded at any given price. And this is represented by the change of the original demand curve to a new position, denoted by an entirely new demand curve. So what we see here is that increase in demand between 2012 and 2013, because at every single price, a new higher quantity is demanded. And when we graph those points and connect the dots, we have a new demand curve that has shifted to the right of the demand curve, and movement rightward on the horizontal axis represents an increase in demand. So when the demand curve moves to the right, that represents an increase in demand, and when the demand curve moves to the left, that represents a decrease in demand. So here, let's again look at the difference between these terms. A movement along the demand curve, we said, is a change in the quantity demanded. Not a change in demand, a change in the quantity demanded of a good. Every single point along the demand curve represents a different quantity demanded at different prices. So when we move along the demand curve, this would be reflected as a movement from A to B. Now when we move from A to B, what happens? Well, the quantity demanded increases from 8.1 billion pounds of cotton to 10 billion pounds of cotton. But we moved from A to B along the same demand curve, and the price went down from $1.50 to $1. So this is an increase in quantity demanded caused by a decrease in the price of the good, and that is represented by movement along the demand curve from A to B. But we can get that same increase in quantity demanded we can get that same increase in quantity demanded by moving from A to C. We increased the quantity demanded from 8.1 billion pounds to 9.7 billion pounds. That's still an increase in demand. But notice the price didn't change. When we go from A to C, the price is still $1.50. But we have an increase in demand. Why? Something else, one of those other factors, caused us to buy more cotton despite the fact that the price remained the same. So this is what we call a change in demand, not a change in quantity demanded. And it's caused by a shift of the demand curve rather than movement along the demand curve. Those are two different things caused by two different forces. So keep in mind that a shift of the demand curve is not the same thing as a movement along the demand curve, and movement along the demand curve is only caused by a change in price, and a shift of the demand curve is caused by any other factor. So remember, to represent this graphically, if you want to show an increase in demand, you shift the demand curve to the right, going from D1 to D2. And you label the demand curves properly. The original demand curve is labeled D1, the new demand curve would be labeled D2. If you want to show a decrease in demand, then you shift the demand curve to the left, and that is represented as a shift of the curve from D1 to D3 and shows a decrease in demand. And why is that so? Because we measure demand on the horizontal axis. So moving to the right represents an increase in those numbers, and moving to the left represents a decrease in those numbers as measured on the x-axis. So an increase in demand means a rightward shift of the demand curve, meaning at any given price, consumers demand a larger quantity than before, and a decrease in demand is represented by a shift to the left. So what can cause a shift of the demand curve? Well, we've already looked at one thing that can cause a change in demand, and that is an increase or decrease in the population. We call that a change in the number of buyers. An increase in the size of the population or an increase in the number of buyers will increase demand for a good, and a decrease in population or decrease in the number of buyers will decrease demand for a good. But there can also be a change in the price of related goods. Now, not all goods are related to each other, but some goods are related to each other. And when they are related to each other, they are related in one of two ways. They are either substitutes for each other, meaning that one good can stand in place of or replace another good, or they are complements of each other, meaning that the two goods go together and they are purchased at the same time. So substitute goods, let's look at those first. Goods are substitutes if one good can replace another good. If consumers look at another good as being similar enough to one good to be able to stand in place of another good. So, two goods are substitutes if a fall in the price of one of the goods makes consumers less willing to buy the other good. Why? Because if the price of one good falls, then you'll buy more of it, and you'll buy less of a good that you could substitute for it that would now be more expensive. And the reverse is true. If the price of a good that is a substitute rises, it will make consumers more willing to buy the other substitute good. So, for example, if the price of Nike shoes rises, the demand for New Balance shoes should shift to the right. Complementary goods are goods that are used together, like tennis balls and tennis rackets. When goods are complementary, there is an inverse relationship between the price of one and the demand for the other. So if the price of tennis rackets rises, demand for tennis balls will shift to the left. It will fall. Why? Because if the price of tennis rackets rises, then the quantity demanded of tennis rackets will go down, and the demand for tennis balls will also go down. So goods don't have to be related to each other, but if they are complements, then a fall in the price of one good makes people more willing to buy the other good, and an increase in the price of one good makes people less willing to buy the other good. If they are substitutes, a fall in the price of one good makes consumers less willing to buy the other good, and an increase in the price of a good makes consumers more willing to buy the other good. The next factor that can shift the demand curve is a change in income. Generally, think of this as how much money you have to spend. If income goes up, if people have more money to spend, they'll buy more goods. If they have less money to spend, they'll buy fewer goods. And this is always the case if goods are normal goods. When a good is considered to be a normal good, and most goods out there are normal goods and behave this way, but when goods are normal goods, when a rise in income occurs, that increases the demand for the good. When income falls, it decreases the demand for the good. And when that happens, and that's true with most goods, we say it's a normal good. But there are some goods that behave differently. When income goes up, it decreases the demand for a good, and when income goes down, it increases the demand for a good. Well, why would this happen? Well, first of all, we call these inferior goods, and there aren't a lot of them out there, but when that happens, we call those inferior goods. So, for normal goods, more income leads to an increase in demand, less leads to decrease in demand. So, for example, steak is a normal good. People buy more steak when their incomes go up and buy less of it when their income goes down. So are textbooks, running shoes, and iPads. Inferior goods are goods where more income leads to a decrease in demand. City bus tickets are inferior goods because people would probably rather drive their cars. But if they have less money and they can't afford a car, then they'll take the bus. So is secondhand clothing. When people have more money, they'd rather buy clothing at Macy's or something place like that. But if their income goes down, then maybe they can only afford to buy secondhand clothing or store brand food items. Those are goods that are considered to be inferior goods. They behave in the opposite way. The next factor that can shift the demand curve is a change in tastes and preferences. When something is popular, when it's in style, when it's in fashion, when people have a taste or preference for something, they will demand more of it. When something goes out of fashion, it's unpopular, it's not in style, or it's not the right season, then people will not have a taste or preference for something. So a favorable change in tastes and preferences leads to an increase in demand for a good, and an unfavorable change in tastes and preferences leads to a decrease in demand for a good. For example, demand for a sports team's apparel increases when the team is winning. Look at how many Broncos jerseys and shirts and hats were sold last year when they went to the Super Bowl. And yet when a team isn't winning, people don't buy as many jerseys. So economists usually lump together changes in demand due to fads, beliefs, cultural shifts, and so on under the heading of changes in tastes or preferences. And then the final thing that can affect the demand curve and shift it is a change in expectations about the future. Consumers have expectations about future prices. They have expectations about future product availability. They have expectations about their future income. And these expectations about future prices, product availability, and income can affect their demand for a good or service in the present. For example, if I expect the price of gas to decrease next week, my demand for gas will decrease this week. I will wait for the price to fall before I buy gasoline. If I take a new job and expect my salary to rise next month, I may increase my demand for a new suit today, even before my income goes up, with the expectation that it will rise. So far we've been talking about the individual demand curve. So each person has a different individual demand for a good or service. And so we can, in graph A, we can graph Darla's individual demand curve for blue jeans, and you can see that Dino has a different individual demand curve for blue jeans because they each have a different willingness or ability to pay for blue jeans. So they have different demand curves. Each individual has a different demand curve than another individual for blue jeans. But when we talk about the market demand for a good or service, we're talking about the sum total of all individual consumers' demand curves for a good or service. So what we do is we add up all of the individual demand curves, sum them together, and that creates the market demand curve for a good or service. So the market demand curve is the horizontal sum of the individual demand curves of all consumers in the market. Here is a graph that you may wish to copy into your notes that summarizes for you the 5 different demand curve shifters that we talked about in this module. There is an FYI activity on beating the traffic that you will complete later on in this on your launch pad, and this talks about it a little bit here, but I'm not going to talk about it too much right now in the video, but you'll be coming back to this a little bit later on. And so now let's summarize what we've learned in this module, introducing the law of demand. We've learned, number 1, the supply and demand model illustrates how a competitive market works. The demand schedule shows the quantity demanded at each price and is represented graphically by a demand curve. The law of demand says that the demand curve slopes downward. 4th, a movement along the demand curve occurs when a price change leads to a change in the quantity demanded. When economists talk of increasing or decreasing demand, they are referring to shifts of the demand curve, a change in the quantity demanded at any given price. There are 5 main factors that shift the demand curve. A change in the prices of related goods or services, and they can be related as substitutes or complements. A change in income, and goods can react as normal goods or inferior goods. A change in tastes and preferences of consumers. A change in future expectations about income, product availability, and prices. A change in the number of consumers or population. And finally, the market demand curve for a good or service is simply the horizontal sum of the individual demand curves of all consumers in the market. This concludes our look at Module 5, the law of demand.